Hello everyone, wishing you all a wonderful day. Today, we're going to discover the unbelievable journey of a millionaire CEO who lost everything, abandoned the city, and found peace in the mountains as a simple farmer. How did a man surrounded by luxury end up harvesting lychees and rebuilding his life with his bare hands? Stay with me until the end, because this emotional transformation might completely change the way you think about success and happiness. And if you enjoy meaningful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next videos. Triệu Khang woke up before sunrise, not because of an alarm clock or an urgent phone call, but because of the unfamiliar silence surrounding the old wooden house hidden deep in the mountains. For a few seconds, after opening his eyes, he forgot where he was. Then slowly, the memories returned. The company, the debt, the sleepless nights, the city he had left behind. Rain from the previous night still dripped softly from the roof outside, while cold mountain air drifted through the slightly opened window beside his bed. He remained lying there quietly, staring at the old wooden ceiling above him. For years, every morning had begun with pressure crushing his chest before his feet even touched the floor. But this morning felt different. The problems still existed. The debt had not disappeared. His company was still collapsing somewhere far away in the city. Yet for the first time in years, his mind was strangely calm. Triệu Khang slowly sat up and walked outside the house. The mountains were covered in light mist, and the bamboo trees surrounding the yard swayed gently in the wind. The small countryside home looked even older in daylight than he remembered. Parts of the wooden fence had fallen apart. Wild grass covered most of the garden. Farming tools rested beneath the porch, untouched for years and layered with dust. The place looked abandoned, almost forgotten by time itself. But standing there in silence, Triệu Khang felt something unexpected growing inside him. Not fear, not regret, something closer to relief. Back in the city, every minute of his life had belonged to someone else. Investors wanted answers. Employees wanted security. Banks wanted money. Everyone needed something from him. But here, surrounded only by mountains and wind, nobody expected anything at all. He walked slowly toward the overgrown garden beside the house. Beneath the weeds, he could still recognize the old vegetable beds his family once cared for many years ago. His father had spent countless mornings working on this land when Triệu Khang was still a child. Back then, he never understood why his father seemed content, living such a simple life. As a young man, Triệu Khang believed happiness only existed in big cities, expensive offices, and financial success. He spent years trying to escape places like this. Yet now, after losing almost everything, he somehow found himself standing right back where he began. That morning, Triệu Khang picked up an old rusted hoe, resting against the wall. The wooden handle felt rough in his hands. He stared at it awkwardly for a moment before stepping into the garden and beginning to clear the weeds covering the soil. The work was slow and exhausting. Within less than an hour, sweat covered his shirt and dirt stained his hands completely. His back ached from movements his body was no longer used to. Several times, he stopped to catch his breath while staring across the quiet mountains around him. In the city, he once managed hundreds of employees, negotiated million-dollar contracts, and built an entire company from nothing. But now, even clearing a small piece of land felt difficult. Still, he kept going. The days that followed were not peaceful in the way many people imagine when they dream about escaping to the countryside. Life there was hard, truly hard. Triệu Khang quickly realized that farming demanded patience, strength, and endurance in ways office work never had. He had no experience repairing fences, planting crops, or caring for land. His hands developed blisters from holding tools all day. His muscles constantly ached. Some mornings, he woke up barely able to move from exhaustion. And despite all that effort, things often went wrong. The first vegetables he planted failed because he watered them incorrectly. Heavy rain damaged part of the small garden he spent days preparing. Insects destroyed several rows of crops before he even noticed the problem. There were moments when Triệu Khang stood alone in the middle of the ruined garden, wondering if he had made another terrible mistake. But strangely, even those failures felt different from the failures he experienced in the city. In the corporate world, every mistake came with humiliation, pressure, and fear. Failure meant losing money, status, or reputation. Here, failure simply meant trying again tomorrow. Little by little, Triệu Khang began adapting to the rhythm of the mountains. He woke up early each morning to clean the garden before the heat became too strong. He repaired broken sections of the fence surrounding the property. He learned how to prepare soil properly, how to recognize healthy plants, and how to care for growing vegetables. At night, instead of staring at financial reports, he sat quietly outside the wooden house drinking tea while listening to insects echo through the mountains. For the first time in years, his mind began slowing down. One afternoon, while clearing weeds near the back of the property, Triệu Khang discovered something unexpected, hidden beneath overgrown branches and wild grass. Several old lychee trees still stood there, stretching quietly across the hillside behind the house. Their trunks were rough and aged, but the branches remained alive, and hanging between the leaves were small clusters of red fruit beginning to ripen. Triệu Khang stood there silently for several moments, staring at the trees. He remembered climbing those same branches as a child while his father harvested lychees beside him. Back then, he thought life in the countryside was small and insignificant. He promised himself he would leave one day and never come back. Yet now, those forgotten trees somehow felt more valuable than the expensive office towers he had spent his entire adult life chasing. Over the following weeks, the lychee orchard slowly became the center of his new life. Triệu Khang spent hours clearing the land around the trees and repairing damaged branches. The work was physically exhausting, but there was something strangely calming about it. Unlike the endless chaos of business meetings and financial negotiations, the trees demanded patience instead of speed. They grew quietly at their own pace, untouched by deadlines or pressure. One morning, after harvesting several baskets of ripe lychees for the first time, Triệu Khang loaded them into the back of his old vehicle and drove toward a small countryside market near the mountains. The market was simple and crowded with local farmers selling vegetables, fruit, herbs, and handmade goods. There were no luxury brands, no business suits, and no people pretending to be important. Everyone there worked with their own hands. At first, Triệu Khang felt strangely embarrassed, sitting behind a small wooden stall selling lychees. Just months earlier, he had been leading meetings inside luxury skyscrapers. Now he was carefully arranging fruit inside bamboo baskets, while elderly women stopped to ask about prices. But something unexpected happened. People smiled at him, not because of his status, not because of money, simply because he was another hard-working person trying to make an honest living. An older woman bought several lychees and told him they tasted sweeter than the ones sold in larger towns. Another customer returned later to buy more for her family. For the first time in years, Triệu Khang earned money that didn't come from contracts, negotiations, or complicated business deals. It came directly from the work of his own hands. That evening, after returning to the mountains, Triệu Khang sat quietly outside the wooden house, holding a cup of hot tea, while the sky slowly darkened above the trees. The debt still existed somewhere far away. His old life had not magically disappeared. But sitting there, surrounded by wind, soil, and silence, he realized something important. For years, he had spent his life chasing success so aggressively that he forgot what it felt like to simply live. And somehow, after losing almost everything, he was finally beginning to find peace again. The mountain mornings slowly became part of Triệu Khang's life. Weeks turned into months, and for the first time in years, his days were no longer controlled by ringing phones, financial reports, or the fear of losing everything overnight. Instead, his mornings began with the sound of wind moving through bamboo trees and the smell of damp soil rising from the garden behind the old wooden house. Life in the countryside was still difficult, but something inside him had changed. The exhaustion that once followed him everywhere in the city had slowly begun disappearing. Every sunrise, Triệu Khang walked through the small vegetable garden, carrying old farming tools in his hands. The once abandoned land behind the house now looked completely different. Rows of green beans climbed carefully built wooden frames. Pumpkin vines stretched across the soil, and fresh vegetables filled the small hillside garden he had restored piece by piece with his own hands. The work remained exhausting, but unlike the pressure of corporate life, this exhaustion allowed him to sleep peacefully at night. The lychee orchard behind the mountain house slowly became his greatest source of hope. The old trees his father once cared for continued producing fruit despite years of neglect. Triệu Khang spent countless hours repairing broken branches, clearing weeds, and carrying baskets of harvested lychees down the narrow mountain roads toward the countryside market. At first, he simply hoped the orchard would help him survive. But over time, the orchard became something much deeper than that. It gave him purpose. One afternoon, while arranging baskets of freshly harvested lychees at the market, Triệu Khang overheard several villagers quietly talking nearby. "Isn't that the man who used to work in the city? I heard he owned a huge company before. They say he lost everything." The comments didn't hurt him the way they once would have. Months earlier, hearing those words might have filled him with shame. Back then, he believed failure defined a person's worth. But now, standing there in simple clothes, with dirt still covering his hands, Triệu Khang realized something surprising. He no longer cared about looking successful. For years, he spent his life trying to become someone others admired. Every expensive watch, luxury car, and business achievement had been part of that endless chase for validation. Yet none of it ever brought peace. Here in the mountains, surrounded by ordinary people living simple lives, nobody cared how much money he once had. They cared whether he treated others honestly, whether his fruit was fresh, whether he worked hard. And somehow, that honesty felt more valuable than anything he left behind in the city. Life slowly settled into a rhythm. In the mornings, Triệu Khang harvested vegetables and lychees before the heat became too strong. Afternoons were spent repairing fences, watering crops, and cleaning the small animal pens behind the house. At night, he cooked simple meals, using ingredients from the garden while listening to insects echo through the mountains outside. The city still appeared in his mind sometimes, especially during quiet moments. He remembered the endless meetings, the sleepless nights, the pressure of pretending to have control while everything collapsed around him. But the memories no longer felt painful in the same way. They felt distant, almost like another lifetime belonging to someone else. One evening, while preparing dinner inside the small wooden kitchen, Triệu Khang's old phone suddenly vibrated on the table beside him. He stared at the screen for several seconds. A former business partner from the city. For a moment, he considered ignoring the call completely. But eventually, he answered. The voice on the other side sounded shocked. "Triệu Khang, is it really true? You're living in the mountains now?" Triệu Khang glanced quietly toward the garden outside before answering calmly. Yes. There was a long silence. His former partner laughed awkwardly before speaking again. "You disappeared completely. People thought you left the country. Honestly, I still can't believe you gave everything up for this." Triệu Khang looked down at his dirt-covered hands resting against the wooden table. Everything. That word stayed in his mind for a moment. Back then, he would have agreed. He would have believed losing the company meant losing everything. But now, sitting inside a quiet wooden house surrounded by mountains and fresh air, he finally understood how empty his old definition of success truly was. "I didn't give everything up," he said softly. "I think I finally found something real." The other man didn't respond immediately. In the background, Triệu Khang could hear city noise through the phone. Car horns, distant conversations, the endless movement of a world he once belonged to. Then came the question he had secretly been asking himself for months. "Do you regret it?" Triệu Khang slowly walked toward the open doorway and looked outside. The vegetable garden stretched quietly across the hillside, while the bamboo trees swayed gently in the evening wind. Nearby, baskets of freshly harvested lychees rested beside the porch, waiting for tomorrow's market. There were no skyscrapers, no luxury cars, no expensive suits hanging in closets anymore. Yet his chest felt lighter than it had in years. For a long moment, he remained silent. Then finally, he smiled. "No," he answered quietly. "For the first time in my life, I feel like I can actually breathe." After the call ended, Triệu Khang remained standing outside beneath the darkening sky. Somewhere far away, the city continued moving exactly as it always had. Millions of people were still chasing promotions, money, status, and approval from strangers. He understood that world better than most people ever would. He understood how easily ambition could consume a person until they no longer recognized themselves. The mountains had taught him something entirely different. A tree never rushed to grow faster. The seasons arrived in their own time. The earth gave back only what people were willing to patiently care for. And happiness, real happiness, could not be measured through money or success. Later that night, Triệu Khang prepared a simple dinner using vegetables from the garden and sat quietly beside the open doorway of the wooden house. The night air carried the smell of soil and bamboo through the mountains, while insects echoed softly in the darkness. His life was still far from perfect. The debt from his old company had not magically disappeared. He still worked hard every single day just to maintain the small farm. Some months remained difficult financially, but despite all those struggles, something important had finally returned to him: peace. Not the temporary satisfaction that came from expensive things or public admiration, but a quiet inner peace he had been searching for his entire life without realizing it. As the wind moved softly through the trees surrounding the small wooden house, Triệu Khang leaned back against the porch and looked out across the dark mountains stretching endlessly beneath the night sky. Years ago, he thought becoming a millionaire CEO would save him. Instead, losing everything became the very thing that finally set him free. After leaving behind his collapsing company and stressful city life, Triệu Khang slowly began rebuilding himself in the quiet mountains. What started as a desperate escape soon became a journey of healing and self-discovery. Day by day, he restored an abandoned garden, cared for old lychee trees, and learned how to survive through honest physical labor. Although farming was difficult and filled with failures, it gave him something the corporate world never could: peace. At the local countryside market, people no longer saw him as a millionaire CEO, but simply as a hard-working farmer trying to live an honest life. When an old business partner later asked if he regretted abandoning everything, Triệu Khang finally realized the truth. Losing his fortune and status had not destroyed him. Instead, it freed him from the pressure, loneliness, and emptiness that once consumed his entire life in the city.